Hi there, and welcome to The Point. My name is David Flav and I'm the minister here, and I'll be giving the talk today. We're continuing our series, Googling God, looking at the big questions people are asking in 2020, and today's topic is, what is the church? For Christians, the church is the people of God. The church is the bride of Christ. We are the representatives of God on earth. But that leads to a problem, because when the church does good things, that's great. But when the church does bad things, that reflects really badly on God, and it puts people off. People are very interested in Jesus, but the church sometimes gets in the way. So how do we work this out? What is the church? Here's what Jesus has to say. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed ears, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" Which is a perfectly reasonable request. After all, here's a good field. In the story, the man has sowed his seed, and yet, common thing that all gardeners know, farmers know, a bunch of weeds appear. "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling up the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." So, the wheat and the tares, that's the old-fashioned way of calling the weeds, are grown together until in the final days, then the wheat will be harvested and the weeds will be thrown away. And from this idea has developed the concept of the visible and invisible church. The visible church, wheat and tares together, everything, the institution, and then the invisible church, those within the institution who are Christians. So how did the Christian church come up with this? Well, here's a picture of the invisible church. It's actually just a special work of art in Belgium that looks clever. But it gives an idea that on the outside of the institution, and you can look in and see who the Christians are, because not everybody in the institution is a Christian. And this helps us explain why the church has done terrible things in history in God's name, by realising that the people who did that weren't the true Christians. They were the ones who were the weeds, the tares. And anybody can say they're part of the institution, anybody can say they're part of the church, but that doesn't mean to say whether they're a Christian or not. The church has done terrible things. There's no way of denying it. In fact, a friend of mine, who is one of these Christians who's had a tremendous conversion experience, spent a lot of his earlier life in jail, where he was not a model prisoner. And he did all kinds of things before he got converted, became a Christian, became a minister. But he said at his ordination service that people had been more horrible to him in church and said worse things about him than they ever did when he was in prison. Which does make you wonder about the invisible and visible church. So where can we find the true church? Well, I would say you can't find the true church in a single denomination or a single congregation or a particular place or time. The church is true when it is feeding the hungry, when it's sharing the gospel, when it's standing up against injustice, when it's taking a knee for those whose lives matter, when it's doing those things that Jesus wants us to do, when it's doing what Jesus calls us to do. That's when the church is true. The church is false when the church goes for its own ends and its own purposes and its own power, when the church ignores the needy and sucks up to those in authority, when the church doesn't stand for anything and means nothing. That's when the church is false. And yet, as we saw the other day when we talk about mixed motives, the church can be those things all at the same time. The church can show in 1 minute remarkable generosity, love and care, and then the next minute put its foot in it completely. We shouldn't be too worried about that. If we look at the early followers of Jesus, we have people like Peter, one of the founders of the church, who was a man who was ready to follow Jesus all the way until he put his foot in it and things went wrong. So disciples like us, people who are trying to follow Jesus, people who are trying to find out more about Jesus, aren't perfect, and we put our foot in it too. So what should we do? So Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." So, what that means is that people will say they're Christians doesn't necessarily mean they are. People say that they're part of the church doesn't necessarily mean they are. And it's all about doing God's will. But it actually goes further than this. Listen to what Jesus says next. "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?'" So the issue is not that these people said they were the church and never bothered coming. The issue was they were very much part of the church and did all these amazing things. "Then I will tell them plainly, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house. Yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. So throughout the centuries, churches which seem to be mighty edifices have turned out to be built on sand and have decayed away, whereas other churches which seem to have nothing about them because they've been built on the rock have grown and prospered, and things have changed. Which brings me to my question. So which is bigger, the visible or the invisible church? Remember, the visible church is the official institution. That's all the people who claim to be Christians and are part of the church. And the invisible church is those people who really are Christians and follow Jesus. So is the visible church bigger, and the invisible church is made up of people who are the real Christians amongst them? Or is the invisible church bigger? Are the Christians all over the place, lots of whom don't go to church? If you're watching at home and you're watching on YouTube, then put your video on pause. If you're watching live on Zoom, then I'll put you into groups and we'll get back to you in a little bit. Well, that's all we got time for this week. I hope you found that interesting and helpful. Next week we'll continue with our Googling God series, but for now, here's my takeaway for this week. So what must we do? Well, we need to be part of the church, both visible and invisible. We need to be part of the church invisible, those people who put Jesus' words into action and do what he said. But we also need to be part of the church visible. We have to be seen to be Christians as well. Sometimes think about the idea of liking cheese. And it's very easy to say, "Well, I like cheese," but that's in the abstract. You've really got to have Wensleydale or cheddar or Gouda or goat's cheese or soft cheese or blue cheese. You can't have them all at once. You've got to choose one. And it may not have all the qualities you're looking for in cheese, but hopefully it'll be the good stuff. And in the same way with the church, wherever you are, you won't have the church that suits you in every way, but you have to choose one, the one that you can be part of, so that you can share with other Christians in following Jesus.